and I can't be as wandering apparently. See, I was thinking I had 3 weeks, and I have just 2 weeks left. And then Heather is back on for the first, or 4th of July weekend. She will begin again. Anyone gonna be here 4th of July week?
Sure.
Oh, good. One never knows. This crowd used to travel more. Now they have people who travel in to see them as you get older.
Or did you mean alive?
So and if you're tracking with me on the scriptures, you get this sense that, well, we're only, we were in chapter 12, 13, so are we just going to cover a third of this? Well, no, because most of that we're not really going to touch on chapter after chapter of dividing the land up. If you really want to do that, I suggest you get if you've got a good study Bible that give you a sense of how the land was divided up. But what we've done so far, up through chapter 10, with the 5 Amorite kings that got the foot of the generals on them for their photo op and symbolizing their end, which was followed very quickly with their actual end as they took the sword to them. And this is the southern win, if you will, taking most of those. So if you take, how's your geography? If you take from about Jericho, so a little above the Dead Sea, right? Across, almost to the Mediterranean, while Judah is given the land all the way to the Mediterranean as part of its tribal inheritance, they never did take the Philistine, from which our word Palestine, right, comes today. And one of those cities you read about pretty regularly in your news, which is what? Still there after all these years? Gaza, or Gaza. Was one of those 5 Philistine, no one's too sure where they came from, the people of the sea. Was it Crete? Was it even as far away as Cyprus? Maybe some influence from the Phoenicians, which are further up the coast. But anyway, end of chapter 10, particularly with the death of these kings from these city-states, the Israelites pretty much control that southern segment. They never take Jerusalem, for instance, till David comes along, and that's one of the big things that is listed for him. And though it wasn't that terribly significant a city at that point. By the way, cities are quite small, right? Can you picture distances in your mind? I go back to my rural roots where out in the small town Minnesota, out on the prairies, very definitive. By the time Minnesota was being settled, the geological way to identify land changed. You no longer had, like out east with the early settlers where you had, well, he owned this land from the Big Oak down to the set of rocks on the bank of the whatever to, it was that sort of, and ownership was that way. Not so long before Minnesota became a state, a national plan put together with these meridian main lines, and then the whole plain, the whole nation is divided into townships and ranges. So ranges and townships. And they're divided on 1 mile markers. So a section of land in farm country is 1 square mile. And the roads originally were largely built along those line markers of townships. And most counties, if they were uninterfered with by natural things like rivers, whatever, are 36 square miles. So your township in standard normal division is 6 miles by 6 miles, divided into 36 sections. 36 sections, a section is 160 acres. And the term that's most common is the back 40, right? That means the 40 acres, 1/4 of a section. So, all this leading up to the cities, the fortified cities that we're talking about at this stage, are maybe 10 to 20 acres is all. So a 1/2 mile by a 1/4 mile. So we've got what, 20 blocks at most, is the size of a fortified city. So these are not what we think of course, as cities. But the cities were fortified. They often had water in their access from within the city. This is a great little book that I spent quite a bit of time this week into. The Compact Handbook of Old Testament Life. And it digs into the archaeology of the time and talks about the cities, the land, the names, the how water was dealt with in the cities, warfare, weaponry, family life, all those sorts of things. So great, fun book, and if anyone has no idea if it's still available, most of my stuff when I was 50 years old. When I didn't mark it. Usually I have a record of when I bought it and maybe how much. In the old days when buying a book was a grand experience because the money wasn't there, right? So the cities, even the city of Jerusalem, when David takes it, is probably less than 15 acres. So less than a 1/2 mile by a 1/4 mile then in size. All of Palestine is about the size of Wales. If you picture, are we picturing England in the size of Wales there. So this is why they wanted to, but the cities, those are the fortified cities, and then these little villages of maybe 15, 20 little homes or Bedouin tent systems or whatever. that kind of surround the city. And as I spoke earlier, these were much more like the feudal system of England, where the lord owns it all, in this case a chieftain or a tribal leader, and doles it out or deals with squabbles between people if they're fighting over the land. But this is why you wanted to get those troops, right, when they're chasing the troops down. And Joshua just said, roll a stone in front of that cave where these guys are hiding and get on with it. Because you want to catch them before they get back into a fortified city. And so the battles go on. And when we get to the end here of, and we're into chapter 10, they've defeated most of those kings in most of those the fortified cities in that lower southern part of Palestine. And you end up with a summary in chapter 10, beginning in verse 28. Mine has a subtitle there, Southern Cities Conquered. And then chapter 11 begins with the northern kings that were defeated. So a little further north. This hasn't really got totally into the way north, but it does do a quick, trying to think of how this could be described if you're describing the Civil War, and had to do it in 5 paragraphs. Your overview is pretty small as you try to give a general idea of what took place, and that's what we have here. But it was important to them that they killed off these kings. The people that were defeated were really, it was done in different ways. The devoted things, that is like Jericho, when the city was dedicated to God, and the way in which it is dedicated to God is every living thing is killed off without taking any of the spoils of war. Okay? Then you have the cities that were not those devoted cities, but they were decimated. And most of all the people that were living were killed off. Men, women, children, wiped out. And then you have the cities or areas where maybe there was attempted to take over, but really didn't. And Scripture gives us kind of a contrast, a contradictory picture of what takes place during the conquest of Canaan. And I'll let you deal with that contradiction, if you will, in your own way. Certainly, and the part of the thrust of the book of Joshua is God fulfills his promises. And he does so, if you get to the way into Joshua 20, it's in the late teens that you have this chapter after chapter dividing up all the land. Anyone with me in chapter 21? I'm at 43. Read 43 through 45.
Thus the Lord gave to Israel all the land that he swore to give to their fathers, and they took possession of it, and they settled there. And the Lord gave them rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their fathers. Not one of all their enemies had withstood them, for the Lord had given all their enemies into their hand. Not one word of all the good promises that the Lord had made to the house of Israel had failed. All came to pass.
Love that, if you don't have that verse 45 underlined, it's one of those grand statements of faith. Not one of all the Lord's good promises to Israel failed. Every one was fulfilled. And while that's true, and the land even when it was divided up, gave certain areas that had not been conquered to various tribes. So you had cities that were, and that's the contradiction that you, clearly they dominated the area. But they didn't really take every single city. The Philistines is an excellent example of that. And while the Israelites took that big fertile plain just inland from the Mediterranean and controlled it, and this is what they were fighting over back and forth through much of Israel's history, right? David, in his strength, pushes them almost into the sea, but never does control their cities. This is where Samson goes and tears down the temple, right? In this area. And cities like Jerusalem, chapter 15, verse 63, if you're skimming through there, for instance, tells you that Jerusalem was not taken. Even though, if you even though that land is given to Judah, technically it's never actually taken as a city. When David comes along, his guys get into one of the water system. It was a well-defended city in terms of its walls and so on. And they come in through a spring, and these things that were done beneath the cities, and that was part of fortification, is you had to get water in, right? And no siege is going to have to last very long if you don't have an internal water system. And so there's quite an elaborate engineering feats accomplished in these old cities. And David's guys go up through that water system, and that's how they take the city of David. And it is the city of David because it was never captured, if you will, by the invasion under Joshua. And it gives him at least something symbolic that says he's not choosing one tribe over the others. When he's king, he has to battle this system of being king for all of the Israelites.
So when they were told, go spy out the promised land, and they saw this wonderful stuff, did they know that they were going to have to go in and battle for all the rest of it? Or did it just...
Yeah, and that's what scared them to death. So we get a picture of some of those, but if you're seeing you've been traveling in the desert, right, in tents, and you go spy out this land with big fortified towns.
Oh, so what you're saying is they went in and spied out not just where Rahab was, they spied out all this.
Well, the original spies, remember, are 40 years before that, before Rahab. But yeah, same thing. They're spying out the land. We get a few pictures of this.
Okay, so they spied out more than that. So.
Oh yeah, yeah. And that's what scared them, and ends up with that additional 4 years in the wilderness. Because they've been a slave people, they really don't have a military that looks like a strong military. Yeah, and 2 were good and 10 were bad.
Well, I understand all that, but it just seems that it wasn't, totally clear.
Well, they saw these giant people over in Connecticut, maybe put the Philistines
Oh,
there
sure.
when they got with the Goliath land.
Okay, so they saw more than Jericho when they went around hanging out the sign.
Oh, yeah, you're probably not, I mean, you're not talking about a weekend camping trip into the mountains. That spy trip is probably a month or more in various areas as they go in and.
I thought it was more cut and dry, so.
So we have some of this that tries to summarize it in our victory. But again, back to my illustrations with Normandy and so on, right? We almost declare victory for ourselves once we get a beachhead in Normandy. But there's a lot of battling still to go. And even as the book summarizes it, as if they now control absolutely everything. Another good story in that would be chapter 17, where when the land is divided up, remember, Joseph's 2 sons make up kind of two tribes. The Levites aren't going to get any land, right? And except when you read it, they're given cities in each of the tribes. And they give you a list of all of these, which cities they were given for living in and being supported by others. But even farming land for them and their, not a lot of cattle at this stage, more for goats and sheep than for cattle, but some cattle likewise. But in chapter 17, both Ephraim and Manasseh come to him and say, hey, we are blessed. There's so many of us. We need more land. You didn't, you needed to give us a bigger portion. What they've done is they sent the administrators through who did surveying, all the descriptions, all the cities, all the, try to put some maps together. And then they sit and they divide this, and then they draw lots from the 7.5 tribes, and who gets chosen next, okay? Here's what's left, which is your block. We want your block. So you have that kind of thing recorded for us, and then they describe for you the land that each one gets. But in chapter 17, when Ephraim and Manasseh write that they are blessed, and you go back to that, right, of the blessing by Joseph himself, just as he's about to die, and blesses his sons, and gives the old switcheroo as to which the eldest and the youngest with blessing, but they prized that being blessed, and there were so many of them. But anyone know what the response of Joshua is when they come begging for a bigger portion? Like my fights with all the brothers, how big a pie is left and who gets what?
Was the 3 asked for more?
Ephraim and Manasseh, they want more land. What's the response?
Probably said something about today.
No, what he says to them is, go up into the hill country and clear a bit, and we'll clear out the people and have your land. You're a big boys.
Oh,
You're a strong people. your military, your fighters are good, go take more land in what's been allocated to you, but up in the forest areas, much more forest in Palestine at that stage than today. And so you have both this, yes, God has fulfilled his promise, but don't treat that as though that means every city, everything was totally under their control. And that helps you understand a little bit, too, as to why there's trouble with idols and worship of the Ashtaroths and so on, the Baal worship of the day. Why that was so easily there is because a lot of the people were not killed off. Those who had a much more pagan background. And maybe more so in the northern, what eventually becomes the northern kingdom, right? The kingdom of Israel. But, so I just want to emphasize that, yes, they saw this as the completion of God's fulfillment of his promise to Abraham, but from a practical standpoint, it wasn't a kingdom that suddenly is all Israelite and all committed to these things. Okay. But
And I think that speaks to us too, doesn't it, as Christians, like God says, you know, this is going to happen or this or that, but as Christians, we can't just sit back and say, well, I'll pray for it, which we do, but we need to work too. We need to do the work and not be weeds about things, you know, so.
absolutely, and we have lived in a culture that has been nominally Christian in this country, and we Christians are currently in this panic about the world suddenly is no longer supportive, certainly not even really nominally Christian. The number of people going to church, it keeps dwindling. And we are literally in a panic that the values we've wanted and we've been lucky enough to live with for 200 years, doesn't mean everyone was a committed Christian, but it's fading fast. And Brent preaches pretty regularly, right, along those lines to us within our culture. So my takeaway for today, big one for today, and another one for next week as I wrap up, comes actually from chapter 13, which again looks like you're barely into the book, well, right? But no, they've dominated the country already by now. And if you're with me, chapter 13, verse 1. When Joshua had grown old. Our problem is we don't know a timeline, really. How long was the invasion before the land is divided up? How quickly were they taking over these cities? It was part of their celebration. You will have homes that you did not build. You will drink wine from vineyards you didn't plant. It was that sort of domination. And they felt the victory of the times. But even with Joshua growing old, remember, we know Caleb's age. So he was 40 when they were sent to spy. He was 80 when they invaded 40 years later. We know at least a 5-year battle plan, if you will, because Caleb talks of now being 85. So he gives us a little bit, but we still don't know where the Israelites were in conquering the land by the time Caleb's 85. Joshua's presumably about the same age, but he lives to be 110. So we have a long period here of, even if you take kind of Caleb's age as a guide, you know, you have 30 years worth in the promised land. When it refers to a Joshua had grown old, does this mean when he was 85, 90, 95, 97, right? Are you old, Gene? You are old, okay. 100, 105. When is this? But Joshua has a message. The Lord has a message for Joshua. You are now very old. What? What comes after the comma?
Advanced in your years.
You still got work to do. And you still got work to do. There remains much land to be possessed. So, there is that sense of victory. In Europe, a lot of people still died. Our troops died after Paris was liberated, right? There's still a lot of battling going on, but the end looked like it was pretty clear that we were in the last stages. So when I was about 14, that would be 60 years ago, for those who don't know how old and decrepit I am, my problem is Jean has got 20 years on me, and she's still going strong. And I feel old. But we were at youth camp, and I don't remember who the speaker was. But maybe this is where my love for this passage, this book of Joshua, the whole entrance into the promised land. He preached this week. We were out on a farm. We didn't have Pine Haven kind of camping. Stuffed grass into these big bags and tried to make a mattress enough to sleep on, whatever. But the preacher, whom I do not remember even his name, but I remember this being repeated 100 times a day. There remains much land to be possessed. And that was so deep inside of me, and the challenge that said, there's work to be done. And we, folks, can't sit on the laurels of 200 years of kind of Christian culture. There remains much land to be possessed. We have to be able to get out of our sense of victory and into the possession of the land. In fact, when it's divided up, my verse marked down here. It says, how long are you going to wait before you get along to settling this? To the tribes. And they're, well, have we really been divided? Has the land been divided? Do we know which ones are ours? But so, again, because the timeline is so unclear, the story is like it bounces around in this 35-year period, with the last being described as God having given rest to the people. It didn't mean they controlled everything, but there was not outright warfare, and the tribes had been their fighting men had been able to return with all the plunder. Remember, that's the other way of it. Cities that were defeated, you had those that were devoted to God. You had those that they went in and wiped out and wanted to claim the city to live in. But you also had plunder, and part of this was you got a lot of plunder. I remember, I can't tell you. Anyone remember the story of one of the judges? Was it Gideon? And when they had defeated the enemy from across the river, kept waiting till harvest and then come in and swoop and take all the grain. And Gideon simply says, well, this is all I want out of this. Each one of you will give, was it one ring, one gold ring, and something from the camels, they wore elaborate neck things. And then I read how much this would have resulted in from a military of 50,000. You got a lot of gold if you got a nice ring from each one of the warriors. So out of their plunder, the kickback was just a ring. So a lot of plunder, and the Israelites saw wealth like they had never seen or imagined they would have. You can imagine how celebrative they were that their God had provided, right? But when Joshua had grown old still, there remains much land to be possessed. And that phrase still stands with me in the good old King James, beginning with youth camp when I was about 14. And that sense that God had a lot of work to do. And so the takeaway from the story is, despite how great and relaxed we want to feel in our day, when things are going well, particularly, right? And that's when we're blessing God and praising Him for all that has gone well. And I'm sure He gains great joy from the praise and honor of His people. But I hear Him kind of reaching out at the end of that with, there remains much land to be possessed. We celebrate retirement, and all except Sue, who thinks she should do this till she's 110. She's competing with Joshua, right? But the rest of us, and you look at that as that finally, a lot of jokes about retirement and a lot of celebrative that we're allowed to do. Yeah, my favorite, every day is a Saturday. No, to me it just means Saturday is another day of the same that the rest were. And Shirley's trying to get me to take note of the time. And what I have to point you to then is in Joshua 13, following this much land to be possessed, we get another little glimpse of Caleb, the other good spy, right? I don't know how big of buddies these guys were, but having been pronounced there's still lots of work to do, Caleb gives a little speech. Now his speech is twofold. One, he's making a commitment to Joshua, which he was clearly, this was a strong military leader, and they were amongst the most senior, because most of them had died off during those 40 years. Anyone over 20 was really not there to partake in all of this. And Caleb gives a little speech. One is his dedication, send me out. 14. And he reminds Joshua, he's trying to claim land. So he reminds Joshua that Moses had promised him when they went up to spy out the land, and Moses said, "You are going to get this land." And 40 years later, Caleb has not forgot that promise. And he lays it before Joshua and says, "You recall the good old days when we were young and this promise was made. Now, fulfill the promise." And so that's the one side. But the other side is a lovely response to that there remains much land to be possessed. He said, "I was 40 when we went to spy out the land. I was 80 when we finally had the chance to do it. I am now 85, and I am just as ready to take on the battle as I was when I was 40. So give me my orders. I and my men." Now see, this is where I get discouraged. I got another decade before I'm 85, and I already don't want more orders. I want to sit at the city gates and pronounce judgment as a part of law. I don't want work. In fact, I just hired a couple teens. I'm so far behind on my yard and everything. I've got a couple teens coming in this week to work my yard and garden and pull weeds and mow lawn and try to get me somewhere caught up. Take out my pond that I can no longer, I don't have the time to deal with it. I remember Steve's pond, and Phyllis got rid of that right after.
No, I didn't.
Oh, you didn't? I thought that you did.
No, my new neighbor, the people that bought it did, but
Ah, you kept it up.
I
Oh,
don't.
I'm too old. So anyway, this is where I both feel challenged on the one hand, but shake my head and say, I don't know that I want to fulfill any more of the battle plans. But Caleb is that, and they're great challenge, great. I'm assuming Caleb is not marching into the front lines personally. But he, probably more than others, as they were getting ready to take the promised land, he knew what they were up against. And my guess is his clan was probably the most prepared for battle of most anyone amongst all the Israelites in the 12 tribes. He had done the spying. He knew what those fortified cities were, and it would probably be his clan that he's directing as his military, not he himself. But you never know. I've met some 85-year-olds that look like they could probably take on the world. And so our challenge, our takeaway then, if you will, is there remains much land to be possessed. And the challenge is before us. Who's willing to be the Calebs? Those ready to take the front lines, those ready to lead the charge with completing the promise of God. With those of us that would prefer to be in our Barco lounger and God comes and hands over a deed to the 40 acres, each man 40 acres and a mule, right? And we prefer that kind of approach. That's not how the spiritual battles take place. Okay, here it comes. I have to turn my head so she doesn't think I'm watching her before she'll get her. Then when I look up nicely, that's when I get it. So we jump next week. If you read between chapter 15 and chapter 20, you're going to read a lot of dividing up the land and some of the northern battles, and your geography is, you try to place these things, so you've got to know where the mountains are and where the valleys are, and which ones go from the Mediterranean to the Jordan, and which ones go up and down. Rough going. And I have to keep a book like this at hand where I can look at the geography and the list of cities and the, to follow what's going on. But we're going to jump then to the end of the primary battles. When they've taken the land, largely control it, and people are allowed to go home with their battle spoils, and up to the death of Joshua. And we're going to pull another takeaway from that, and then Heather will be, I'm not sure what the theme is that she's going to pick up on. Okay, Father, we do thank you. We thank you for the fulfillment of promise. We are challenged by the fact that we have a role to play, that it's not just dropping into our laps for us, but that nonetheless you are the one handling that master plan. And we are reminded as we look at each of these individuals that you also are reaching down to us individually, that relationship and that status of character and commitment is likewise important to you. Be with us in this special Lord's Day and in our time of worship before you, for we pray through Christ our Lord. Amen.